when you come into the 21st century, roughly around 2002, somewhere between there and 2006, we start discussion on what is known as sulfide mining. Roughly around between 2002, 2006, mining companies started to get pretty serious about taking a look at the richness of various metals that northern Minnesota had. Copper, nickel, zinc, a whole cobalt, a whole bunch of titanium, etc. The problem is it was located in an environment that is a water environment. And we know one thing, the sulfide type of mining and water do not get along. When you go for copper, for instance, you release sulfuric acid, which all of a sudden releases all sorts of other harmful chemicals, including asbestos, mercuries, et cetera, into the waters. And frankly, it destroys the waters. So in this case, you've got mines that are adjacent to watersheds that interact really with almost the entire state of Minnesota. The Tamarack mine, of which you're concerned, that will affect the Kettle River. The Kettle River, it basically contains and services all those lakes that allow for wild rice cultivation, etc. It goes into the St. Croix, which goes into the Mississippi, which goes into the faucets of the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So this is not an issue that concerns only those who are near these mines. This is an issue that concerns southern Minnesota as much as north. This is a statewide concern. And state laws are wholly inadequate for sulfide mining. There isn't the slightest relationship between the existing laws on the books and the laws that should be regulating sulfide mining. But neither the governors nor the legislatures have done one single thing to change those laws. Now, I'll go into that later as to why I think that is the case. But here we sit in 2023, and we're about a year away from what might well be the start of sulfide mining. And from there on out, we will be the victims. Now, the second thing is, we have a state system that does not have the capacity to evaluate these proposals. Right now, the power rests with the Department of Natural Resources. Well, let me ask you this, and this is just a common sense question. Can you imagine any employee in the Department of Natural Resources having the financial background to untangle who owns what with Tau Capital? You think they're capable of reading financial statements? You think they're capable of all the various inter-ownerships that are involved here? Absolutely not. The Department of Natural Resources was never created for that purpose. That's a financial obligation. Nor does the Department of Natural Resources have the engineering talent to decide what is competent engineering and what is incompetent engineering. We all know from that wonderful video that was put out by the Duluth for Clean Water, the devastating comments made by two consultants to the DNR. One of them said, the safety plan, this is where the residual mining waste is to sit for posterity. And if it leaks out of that basin, we're doomed. I think on that there's common agreement. But relative to the safety of that basin, one person said the proposal gives them indigestion, and the other one called it a Hail Mary. Now, how many of you would invest in a company where the consultants say it's a Hail Mary or it makes them sick? What is alarming about that is that it alarms you, it alarms me, but it did not alarm the governor. It did not alarm the staff of the governor. It did not alarm the department heads. It did not alarm the legislature. That is what's alarming. There's a real disconnect here. And that is, why is our elected system so free and so supportive of all of these international mining companies that are going to come in, extract our ore, and sell it on the global market? Much of it oriented, curious enough, to both Russia and China. And as far as I know, we're not getting along with them too well. And there's nothing in the agreements that guarantees jobs either. And as a matter of fact, companies like Glencore are not even on the agreement. They're operating through a shell company called Polymet. And we all know what a shell is. A shell is a company you set up to avoid liability. So if anything goes wrong, and heavens knows it will go wrong, you just flop into bankruptcy, disappear, and the taxpayer of Minnesota is stuck with the waste and the damages and the costs. And this happened, I think it was in 2019, in January of 2019, down in Brazil. The dam collapsed, and it cost over $6 billion worth of damage, and 270 people were killed. So we're talking about an astronomical harm that is going to cause to our quality of life. And I truthfully don't know where Minnesotans will get their drinking water. In 2019, we got the first warning from the state of Minnesota through the PCA, the Pollution Control Agency, issued a report and said, you know what? 58% of your waters are now contaminated. The word they used is impaired. Impaired means you can't swim and you can't drink. But you can look at it. But you can't use it. 58%. I think that was right. 2 years later, they added another 304 bodies of water to that. And this fall, they'll add more to it. But one of the bodies they added that nobody paid attention to was the Upper St. Croix. Well, the Upper St. Croix flows into the Mississippi, and the Mississippi is where the Twin Cities get their water from. And as the Mississippi flows down south, a lot of communities, not just in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but all the way south, draw their water from the Mississippi. And likewise, the mine outside of Babbitt, if I've got my geography correct, but in any event, the New Range copper nickel mine, the old Polymet, that will flow, if that basin breaks or leaks or anything happens to it, right into Lake Superior. Lake Superior is the largest body of surface fresh water in the world. It's our ultimate reservoir. If everything else were to go bad, we could rely upon Lake Superior. And now all of a sudden, that's being threatened as well. So we're not just talking about the BWCA. We're not talking about all the territory from western Lake Superior to Kenora, Ontario, right through Lake of the Woods, destroying the hunting, the fishing, the camping, all of that goes. But also, all of that water is now damaged and cannot be used. So the question becomes, where would Minnesota get water? And the honest truth is, the state can't answer that question. State has no one that's vested with the responsibility to protect the quality or the availability of healthy water in Minnesota. There's been no effort whatsoever to change that. That's what bothers me.
Arne, there are two questions in the chat.
Fire away.
Okay, so the first one is, when you were governor, did you deal with any of these issues when you were in office?
No, we did not at that time have anything that was known as sulfide mining. So we operated under the old laws.
Okay.
And then the new situation arose is, well, when a new situation arises, government has the first responsibility is, my God, we got to rearrange the laws to deal with this new situation. That's understandable. If we need new technologies and new staff competencies, you automatically react to that and do it. It's an automatic thing. It's not a political decision. It's not a partisan decision. It's just a good management decision. Otherwise, you go out of business. But our people did nothing. And the compelling question is why? And this is where the situation gets even worse than what I've outlined so far. In 2010, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision called the Citizens United, which opened the floodgates for corporate interests to pour their money into America's political system. And from that point on, politics in America changed. Many of you are roughly, I don't want to say you're of my vintage because I'm in my 80s, but we're all of the older set. And we remember the days when the Democrats raised their money by having $5 bean feeds. Anybody remember that? Okay, good, some. And Republicans went door to door and knocked on the doors of Republicans and asked, neighbors, can you give $5, $10 to the Republican Party? And then the Republicans, being the party of the fat cats, had that one big dinner every year. It was $100 a plate dinner. And that was the fat cat participation in the Republican Party. Now, with the floodgates open, in 2020, we analyzed and we put out a report called The Future is Today. And if anybody wants it, just send me an email. And that report outlined that the four caucuses, the four political party caucuses in the legislature for the 2020 elections raised over $26.5 million. That did not come from $5 bean feeds. How much of that is dark money, we'll never know, because they also didn't change the disclosure laws. We made no effort to change the ethics laws, the disclosure laws, or to deal with any of the ramifications of Citizens United. And now we have mining companies who specialize in bribery. Let's not kid ourselves, and I'm being very blunt. And we as a country, our history is that we're used to going into third world countries and extracting minerals. And now we're on the receiving end of that. We're the ones being exploited, and we haven't changed our laws. We haven't changed our culture. We haven't changed anything. Our laws right now is they affect mining. When we talk about sulfide mining, we know it's going to pour poisons into the water. But yet the laws under which these permits are being processed does not cover health. Imagine that. Human health is not a factor. It doesn't cover economics. That's not a factor. It doesn't cover the quality of life. Now, that's a vague expression, but what that means is environmental harm and impact on local communities. It doesn't measure that either. So the laws are indifferent to the very concerns that we have.
Arne, there's a second question. From your perspective, why are you one of the few bipartisan leaders in the state to speak out?
Because I have a low IQ. No, I'll tell you in all honesty, that's really sad. And I mean that sincerely. I governed with the Democrat legislature. And we had our differences of opinion, no question about it. But you know what? It was kind of democracy in action. Mm-hmm. You could call up the Democrat leadership, have a little talk, and say, here's what I would like. They would say, here's what we would like. We could launch a study group as we did in healthcare and came back with what was known as Minnesota Care. But there was always a focus on our belief, Democrat and Republican. Our belief was good policy was good politics. Now it's all politics. And the public good is what's being ignored. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. Let me just read you what the U.S. Justice Department said about Glencore. Glencore owns the North Range, or the New Range copper nickel mining. And they're now the second largest producer in the world of copper. And they're also trying to acquire their partner Tech Resources of Canada. And if they succeed in acquiring Tech Resources of Canada, they'll be number one. And what does that mean? That means they will set the price of copper globally. So you can imagine the enormous profits. That tells us two things. We know this from past research. Billionaires are invested in Glencore. Glencore can give you a return of 20%. If you go to the S&P, you're lucky to get between 6 and 8. So you can see the attraction financially to Glencore. Glencore was founded by a fellow named Mark Rich. I don't know if that name rings a bell to you. But Mark Rich was the guy who was convicted of tax evasion by the United States government. And Bill Clinton, in his very last hour of office, gave him a pardon. And he went to Switzerland and he founded Glencore. He brought together a whole series of mining companies, formed a conglomerate, and frankly, has a trail internationally, particularly in Africa, of bribing public officials, using shabby technology to extract his minerals and leaving behind his catastrophe. Now, here's what the U.S. Justice Department, Glencore in May of last year agreed to a fine of $1.1 billion. $1.1 billion for bribery and for price fixing. And here's what the Justice Department said. The scope of this criminal bribery, notice how we use the word criminal bribery. The scope of this criminal bribery scheme is staggering. Glencore paid bribes to secure oil contracts. Glencore paid bribes to avoid government audits. Glencore bribed judges to make lawsuits disappear. At bottom, Glencore paid bribes to make money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it did so with the approval and even encouragement of its top executives. From where I come from, that sure sounds like a criminal enterprise. And the question is, why is the state of Minnesota doing business with them? Would you ask yourself this? Would you have as a partner a person with that indictment? And yet we're told by our public officials, oh, trust us. Mm-hmm. No. For 5 years, we were not able, or I should say for 4 years to be exact, 4 years, we could not get a public hearing on anything dealing with water quality, mining, or anything. Not a hearing from Republicans and from Democrats. Not a single hearing. I supported Governor Walz when he ran. I contributed to his campaign. I could not get a phone call. I could not get an answer. All I got was Stonewall, Stonewall, Stonewall. I'm going to ask every one of you to email your legislators and tell them in just blunt, understandable English language, why are we doing business with Glencore? That's a fair question.
And Arne, in our area, it's Rio Tinto that's behind Talon Metals. So they have a terrible track record around the world.
They all do. That's exactly it. And I don't know what their relationship is to Tau Capital.
Yeah. There's another question in the chat that's been there a bit. Maybe you can answer this. And this person, Chris, said, we have sulfide minerals in the taconite ore and have results of 50 years of sulfide mining. I don't know that everybody would agree with that. To be able to examine the effects currently in the downstream waters of all taconite mines currently, Swan Lake, Side Lake, Pike Lake of Lake Vermilion, St. Louis Estuary, Bob Bay of Birch Bay Lake are easy to examine today. The huge algae blooms from the sulfide mobilization of minerals in the sediments, including methylmercury. If we can't fix this, we need a moratorium until taconite is cleaned up.
Same thing. It's all, look, Right now, our state government is closed to a discussion of this topic. Therein lies the problem. You and I are having an open discussion. We're all free to ask questions, to answer questions, to participate, but we can't do that with our elected officials. Therein lies the problem. Why can't you as a group have the right to sit down with your governor and have this conversation?
Right.
Why can't you sit down with your legislators and have this conversation? Why can't I, as a former governor, get a single answer from a single elected official on why we're doing business with Glencore? I can't get any answer on why we haven't changed our laws. Nothing on the moratorium. They won't answer anything.
Do you have any idea, this is another question, why Prove It First failed in this first session?
It's the same thing. The Prove It First. I got that bill from a group in Wisconsin that heard of our work. It was Laura Geiger, and they were called Deertail Scientific, kind of a curious name. And they sent the bill to me, and they said that we used to have this in Wisconsin, and then when Governor Walker came in, he and the mining companies managed to get rid of it. But he said it's a good law for Minnesota, and it is. It's a very good law because, as the title says, prove it first. And so one of the environmental groups agreed to get sponsors and everything else. As a matter of fact, that bill points out the hypocrisy in the legislature. I think I'm correct, roughly 2 years ago, a majority of Democrats in the House signed on as authors of the bill, a majority. And yet there was no hearing on the bill. So this meant, and this is where the duplicity comes into it. This allows those legislators to go back to their district and say, see how hard I fought for you. I was an author on Prove It First. I'm really good on this mining issue. But at the same time, in the caucus darkness, they give their vote to the caucus leadership, which denies a hearing. And not one of them has the courage to take on their caucus leadership. None. Money, frankly, is much more important than public policy. That's the trade-off here. Think about it. You get elected to the legislature, and in 2020, for every incumbent, if you were to divide all that money equally, every incumbent would get $130,000. When I ran, I think I raised something like $5,000 to $6,000. So they start out with $130,000. Now, how many of you could raise $130,000 just to have equal footing? Well, and then we pat ourselves on the back on the 4th of July and say, God, what a wonderful democracy we have. And these people know it. That's why they ultimately support money over good public policy. And I've had several of them privately say, oh, yes, you're right. I read your report. Yes, it is corrupt. Will you do anything about it? Oh, I can't.
So there's another question here. How do we stop, and what is the most effective action that we can do now?
There you go. Challenge your legislator. Bring them into meetings like this. I'll come up to your territory and I'll debate your legislator publicly. And I mean it. Flush them out into the open. Let's get a little sunshine on them. That's the way to do it. Letters to the editor. Letters to legislators. Don't come back with a lot of verbiage. Just tell us why we're doing business with these corrupt companies, why we can't get public hearings, why you won't come to meetings of our organization and tell us and be truthful with us. Mm-hmm. And you're going to see it coming up right now. Let me give you a forecast. They're going to close session pretty soon. And they're closing session with what's known as an omnibus bill. An omnibus bill is a collection of diverse pieces of legislation under one umbrella, and you've got to vote it up or down. This allows legislators to come home, and when they're challenged on why did you vote for this bill, they can come back and say, well, I was really not for that bill, but I did like this and this, and so I have to vote for the omnibus bill. In other words, I was stuck. But our Constitution specifically prohibits omnibus bills. Let me, if I can quickly get the language to you. Any 8-year-old can understand it. No law shall embrace more than one subject. Anybody have a problem understanding that one? What the omnibus bill is designed to do is to shift power from the members of that body to its leadership. And I'm going to I'm in the process now of writing a commentary that why do we need 201 legislators if 16 make the decision? So why don't we get rid of all the rest? And let's be honest about it. And every one of those decisions is going to be made behind closed doors. Neither you nor I have any right to participate or to even know. That's not a democracy. I remember when it would come in 1970, it was the first year of Governor Wendell Anderson. He had a very bright, very talented young staff. And it was very, very pro-environment. But more than anything else, there was an air of reform. Ernie Lindstrom on the Republican side took on a bloody fight with the special interest and drove them out of the Republican caucus. The Democrats did exactly the same thing. And they opened up the process. Public hearings for everything, open meetings for everything. The open meeting law came out of that. Everything was open. Now notice how everything is closed. And the omnibus bill is a vehicle that closes and keeps the public out.
There's another question here. There's legislation proposed called the Bad Actor Bill. It hasn't gone anywhere. How do we make it happen?
Ask your legislator.
Yeah. Okay.
Look, these guys, let me be very blunt here. They're being paid to do this. Why are you and I, who are not paid, doing it for them? Mm-hmm. They have a whole research staff. Let me tell you how many they have. This is another one of my favorites. Oh, where did I have so many notes and file drawers here. But they have here. I think they have around 300 what they call partisan staff. Yeah, my recollection is that there's 3 partisan staffers for every member. No, that can't be right. 1.5 for every member of the legislature. A partisan staffer works entirely for the caucus leadership. Now, they come back and they say, oh, yeah, but partisan staff also serves as caucus committees and that. Yes, that's correct. Some of them do work, but they should then be working for the state of Minnesota and not for the caucuses. But they also do things that are political and partisan. Their partisan staffs are bigger than both parties combined, and they raise more money than both parties combined. And ask yourself one question: what is it that they have to sell? Is it good looks? Is it intelligence? What is it that they have to sell? They only have one thing to sell, and that's public policy. Now, this is not something that's coming from me. This is coming from the Humphrey Institute at the University of Minnesota. And they studied the impact of special interest and moneyed interest at the state legislature, and they issued a report in May of 2021. And that report said that the special influence, the special interest influence is enormous. And the word they use, I love that word. They are given the opportunity to, quote, shape legislation. Wouldn't you like to have the ability to go into a conference room and shape legislation? Democrats do it, Republicans do it, the House does it, the Senate does it. That's how they make legislation. It's politely called pay to play. If you pay, you can play, and you can help shape. I came from Bronx of New York, and in those streets of the Bronx, we would call it old-fashioned corruption, because that's what it is. It is corrupt. And that's what we're up against. We're up against money. And right now, our elected officials are more committed to the power of money than they are to their own constituents and to good public policy. And the reason I got into this is because the consideration of water is so great. We in Minnesota grew up, when I came to Minnesota in the fall of 1957, my heavens, what did our sign say? The land of 10,000 lakes?
Yes.
And then we had the Hamm's beer ad with these little animals running around singing about this land of sky blue waters. Now the majority of our water is contaminated, and it's getting worse. And the mining industry will take care of what remains. And our elected officials would not hold public hearings. Why don't they hold public hearings on the bad actors bill? Seriously. Think of all the hearings they held on renaming Lake Calhoun, and not one hearing on clean water. Not one. And yet, 4th of July, they tell us, my heavens, what a wonderful democracy we have. Citizens can participate. No, we cannot participate. If a former governor can be shut out, so too can anybody else.
There's another comment. You had talked earlier about Tau Capital. Tau Capital is an investor in Talon Metals. And Talon's chairman of the board, Warren Newfield, who is the founder of Tau, resigned from a political appointment in Grenada after it was brought to light that he was abusing public subsidies for financial gain. He can be Googled to learn more, but they're as dirty as Glencore.
Well, what I've been trying to find out, and if the person who wrote it can let me know, I'd appreciate it. I've been trying to find out if Tau Capital is still invested in Talon Metals. Talon Metals advertises itself as being, quote, independently managed, but it avoids the word owned. Are they still owned by Tau Capital?
I don't know. That would be something that someone could ask. Another question is, and we could certainly have that person, Shania, write directly to you. A second question is, would you debate Pete Stauber? He's riding the sacred cow named mining.
I would rather, Stauber represents the federal government. My concern is our state government.
Okay.
I really want to focus on that. Because here's where I'm at on that. They got the notice. Let's just pretend that we are part of a board of a corporation. And we get notified that something very big is happening and it directly affects our industry. Why would we ignore it for 13 years? That's precisely what the state of Minnesota did. They knew all about sulfide mining. They would not change the laws. They would not even have a hearing on changing the laws. Neither Governor Dayton nor Governor Walsh would even propose changes to those laws. They knew of the bribery that these companies regularly engaged in. They knew of the conviction in U.S. federal court of Glencore, and yet they did nothing. They didn't upgrade their own ethical standards. They didn't up anything called disclosure. New Jersey did it. Colorado did it. Connecticut did it. Minnesota did nothing. And let me tell you how they launder money through the system. Let's say that you're on a board of X company and you don't want it known that you're donating to certain political figures. You can send that money to, let's say, you form an outfit called the Americans for Good Government. You pack that with your money and you let the Americans for Good Government then distribute it directly to the legislators, and they all know what it means. Or if you want to launder it more, you can give it to the Americans for Good Government. They can give it to a political party, and they can earmark it for that political party to make sure it gets to Joe or Susie. And you and I, as citizens, we haven't got a clue. We think it comes from the Americans for Good Government. And who are they? We assume they're a good committee.
Yep, I am. Hello.
Any other questions? All right, let me end up on this. For none of us is this really a personal venture. This is a caring about the well-being of community. And we have a right in a democratic society to expect our leaders to communicate with us, to work with us. They can disagree with us. That's going to happen. They can disagree with their colleagues in the House or the Senate. That's going to happen. And as long as they do it in a respectful and a respectable fashion, that's wonderful. We expect that. If they compromise, we expect it. That's how you can get agreement. But to sit back and tell the public that this is none of your business, that's autocratic. That's something you expect in the Soviet Union. You don't expect it in the state of Minnesota. But that's exactly how they treated us. It's none of your business. They have shut us out. And then they turn around and tell us, trust us. No, I don't trust them. I don't trust them at all. And that's why I got into this.
There's another question here about why we are not discussing or including the murder of all the plants and animals that the mine would kill, that this is their planet too.
You got it. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. Let me, for a moment, be somewhat personal. I grew up in the Bronx. My parents were Swedish immigrants. We were poor. It was the Depression. Everybody was poor. And I remember as a young kid, my father got a hold of the Encyclopedia Britannica Junior. And I remember reading it. I really did. Ask me any question about the aardvark. But I remember the maps. And I was always drawn to that part of the United States where you saw a lot of green. And it was always, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. Well, when it came time for me to come to grad school, I applied only to those three schools. I didn't apply to them for anything academic. I applied to them because they had that green color. It was a fixation as a child. I mean, imagine what it's like to grow up in concrete. I mean, when I got to high school, I got a scholarship to a private school in Connecticut. When I got there, that was the first time I saw a football field. I had never seen a football field. I mean, you can't imagine what it's like to grow up on streets. And so I deliberately flew into Chicago so I could take a train up to Minneapolis. And then I see these rolling green fields, these farms that never ended. I'd never seen the likes of it. And I remember I was an academic counselor at the University of Minnesota. I remember the kids, the spring of 1958, they wanted to take me to a beach. And we went to Lake Calhoun. And I don't know, there may have been 30, 40 people on the beach. And they said, oh, my God, it's crowded. We should go somewhere else. Crowded. My God, you go to a beach in New York City, you share it with 1 million people. You're lucky if you can get 1 foot of sand. I mean, Minnesota is blessed, absolutely blessed. And I think we've taken our blessings for granted. Mm-hmm. I mean, I now live in Lake City, and I right across the street from the marina. And every time I go down there, I see these kids sitting in the rocks with fishing poles. Oh my God, that's heaven. What are we going to tell those children? Oh, I'm sorry, the fish are poisoned. Is that what we want for our children? And you're right, kids grow up, they know how to hunt, they know how to fish, they know how to camp. As I wrote in one commentary, there has never been a governor in the history of the state of Minnesota who knew less about fishing than me. Even the fish laughed when I came out. But my God, just the joy of being there. We can't take that for granted.
Right.
We have an obligation to give our children and our grandchildren the same opportunity that we had. We had people in public office, Democrat and Republican, who protected those waters, who protected the rights to hunt, to fish, to camp, to trail, to do all these wonderful things outdoors. Now, it's big money, foreign interest, and extract what you want from us and take off. And we'll leave behind a mess, and we'll be responsible for it. That's what we're faced with. And not a single lawmaker is willing to come to our group or answer any of our questions. Not one.
There's another comment, I think by someone with a background in mining engineering. He says there is currently 50 million tons of Duluth complex ore stockpiled at Dunka River Mine upstream of Birch Lake and the BWCA. It was mined in the 70s and is leaching in the BWCA today. How do we get the word out that sulfide mining is ongoing polluting?
We're all back to the same question. We either hold our legislators accountable or we throw them out of office. Stop all this party labeling. Let's get people in there who can rule and serve us with common sense. I enjoyed working with Democrats, frankly. I enjoyed the art of compromise. I liked the policies that we were able to develop. But once you make money the goal, you're destroying the public. And that's what we're going through right now. I mean, just imagine a former governor cannot even get a direct communication from the incumbent governor who he publicly supported. That's astounding. Mm-hmm. Now, let's just say for the moment that all these companies are wonderful and that mining operation is absolutely safe. And it's a good deal for Minnesota. Why don't they come out of the darkness and tell us that? Politicians aren't known for being modest. If this were such a good proposition, why didn't they come out into the sunlight and proclaim it? Oh, it's wonderful. I briefly commented on what it's like to be exploited. We paid no attention when we went down to South America, Africa, etc., and exploited their minerals. But now we are the ones being exploited, and we don't know how to behave.
We'd certainly like to thank you. We are close to the hour. We need to stop for now.
Thank you.
Oh, it's been wonderful. Really helpful.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I really have, and I truly hope that you become a crusader, and don't let these elected officials off the hook with some vague answer. If they can't answer the question on Glencore, then throw them out of office. And I don't care what party they are.
Thank you so much. We'll go ahead and stop the session